Welcome to the Explainer. All right, let's just jump right in, because this one is intense. Picture this. It's October 1962. Somewhere deep beneath the pitch-black waters of the Atlantic Ocean, the fate of literally every human being alive rested inside one man's chest. I mean, we're talking about a historical reality so terrifying it feels exactly like a Hollywood thriller. But every bit of what we're exploring today actually happened. It wasn't some president or a five-star general who held our fate. It was a single, completely unknown Soviet naval officer.
3 billion. That was the population of the Earth at the time. 3 billion people. And this isn't just some abstract historical statistic. That number includes the parents and grandparents of almost everyone watching this explainer today. The literal reason you are breathing right now. The actual reason civilization didn't just end on a random Tuesday over 60 years ago comes down to the isolated actions of this one single man.
Section 1. The Man Who Said No. Vasili Arkhipov. Section 2. 13 Days in October. The Cold War Climax. To really wrap our heads around the immense pressure resting on this quiet, methodical man, Vasili Arkhipov, we have to look at how incredibly fast things escalated in 1962. The US and the Soviet Union had basically turned the planet into a ticking time bomb. Both superpowers were armed with enough nukes to erase every city on Earth. Just follow this timeline with me. First, American reconnaissance planes spot Soviet nuclear missile sites being built in Cuba. President Kennedy issues a swift ultimatum. Then, a US naval blockade is formed across the ocean. And make no mistake, cross that line and it means war. Within days, the military is put on the absolute highest nuclear alert in history. So while the politicians maneuvered up top, everyday citizens were terrified, literally stockpiling food in their basements, preparing for the end of the world.
Section 3. Trapped beneath the blockade. Soviet submarines.
Now, what the terrified public didn't know, and honestly, what even most top government officials didn't know, was that right beneath that US blockade, 4 Soviet submarines were trapped. They were completely cut off from Moscow, and they were armed with nuclear torpedoes. Let's zoom in on just one of them, the B-59. Try to imagine the sheer claustrophobia here. They'd been underwater for weeks. Their radios couldn't penetrate the deep water, so they had zero communication with the outside world. The air inside the sub had turned toxic from carbon dioxide buildup. The temperature inside that metal tube had climbed past 50 degrees Celsius. That is well over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Exhausted men were physically collapsing at their stations, literally suffocating in the dark.
And then the explosions began. American destroyers on the surface had located the sub and started dropping signaling depth charges. Now, to be fair, the Americans meant these as small practice explosives just to force the sub to surface and identify itself. But remember those horrifying conditions we just talked about? The suffocating, exhausted crew of B-59 had absolutely no idea these were just signals. Hearing their metal hulls screaming and shaking under violent explosions, they genuinely believed World War III had already started above them.
Section 4. The Longest Silence. A Captain Breaks.
Driven by the total psychological collapse of his crew and that groaning metal hull, Captain Valentin Savitsky reached his breaking point. Completely convinced the surface world was already burning, he ordered the preparation of the submarine's nuclear torpedo. And to be absolutely clear here, this was a weapon carrying a warhead with the destructive power of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. But let's take a second to methodically break down how a launch actually worked. Captain Savitsky had the authority to fire, but with one massive catch. 2 other senior officers had to agree. So, step 1, Savitsky orders the launch. Step 2, the political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, must agree. And in the total chaos of that overheated, panic-filled room, Maslenikov agreed immediately. Which left step 3. The final, world-ending decision landed squarely and entirely on the shoulders of the brigade commander, Vasili Arkhipov.
Arkhipov said no. Amidst the flickering lights, gasping men, and a captain literally screaming that the war had begun, Arkhipov looked at the weapon. He looked at the captain, and he firmly refused. The agonizing tension in that tiny room created what witnesses later described as the longest silence in human history. You know, his wife, Olga Arkhipova, later captured his profound moral clarity perfectly. She said he did not consider himself a hero, he simply believed he was right. Arkhipov didn't act out of some desire for glory. Acting from pure, solid conviction, he calmly reasoned with the captain who completely outranked him in emotion at that moment. He insisted they could not fire without confirmed orders from Moscow. He argued that the explosions were not weapons of war
and that they had to surface.
Section 5. A buried history. The silent return. No medals.
And incredibly, Captain Savitsky finally stood down. Submarine B-59 surfaced into the gray Atlantic daylight. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended 13 days after it began, and the entire world collectively exhaled. But Vasili Arkhipov? He went home to absolutely zero fanfare. No medals, no ceremonies, nothing. For decades, the incident was strictly classified by both governments. Arkhipov lived a quiet life, never speaking publicly about those dark hours, and passed away in 1998 with the world still completely ignorant of his name. But the mathematical fact of our survival remains. When files were finally declassified at a conference in Havana in 2002, U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who was literally in the room during the crisis, turned pale. Every single war game proved it. If that torpedo had fired, it would have mathematically triggered global annihilation.
Section 6. System versus conscience. An uncomfortable truth.
So you have to ask, why was this kept secret for so long? Well, acknowledging Arkhipov means acknowledging a deeply uncomfortable truth. We all want to believe that the survival of the human race during the Cold War was due to brilliant military strategy, right? Or deterrence theory working perfectly as designed by the system. But the terrifying reality is that we weren't saved by the system. We survived because one tired man chose to think clearly. In a moment when every instinct and surrounding pressure of a broken system demanded he say yes, one man chose his conscience over catastrophe. We simply got lucky.
Which brings us to our final question. Will history remember the conscience that saved it? Vasili Arkhipov saved 3 billion lives. He asked for absolutely nothing, and for decades, history completely forgot his name. But now we know it. And the ultimate takeaway from this explainer is that sometimes the true cost of our continued existence rests not in the hands of massive empires or fancy military strategies, but in the quiet courage of a single person willing to stand firm. Thank you so much for joining me on The Explainer. Until next time, stay curious and keep learning.